Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten back roads of Navajo Nation, places where light fades and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Navajo Nation spans over 27,000 square miles across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Within this vast territory, tribal police officers patrol alone for hours, often on unpaved roads that stretch into darkness. Their duties extend beyond law enforcement. They become first responders, mediators, and sometimes witnesses to phenomena that defy explanation. Established in 1872, the Navajo Nation Police Department is one of the oldest tribal police forces in the United States. Its officers are sworn to uphold the law, but they also serve a community deeply rooted in traditions that predate the modern world by centuries. This intersection of duty and belief creates a unique law enforcement landscape. An officer might respond to a domestic disturbance one hour and a report of a skinwalker the next. They are trained in forensic procedure and firearms, but they also carry with them the cultural understanding passed down through generations. They know the stories, the warnings, the places that are considered sacred or, in some cases, forbidden. This knowledge is not written in any manual. It lives in the hushed tones of elders and in the unease that settles over a landscape at twilight. What happens when those sworn to protect encounter something that cannot be explained by procedure or training? When radio calls describe entities that shouldn't exist? When officers file reports that will never see the light of day? The official documentation often uses sterile language: unidentified female, radio interference, officer resigned for personal reasons. But the stories shared between officers, in the quiet moments before a shift or late at night in the break room, tell a different tale. They speak of a presence that knows their names, that moves through the desert like a whisper on the wind. These are the accounts of Navajo Tribal Police who have come face to face with the unexplained. Stories documented in official reports but quietly filed away. Testimonies shared only among those who wear the uniform. They are stories of fear, yes, but also of a strange and terrible recognition. The central figure in these accounts is known by many names, but most commonly she is called the Whispering Woman. She is described as a spectral entity, often appearing in traditional Navajo clothing, her face perpetually obscured by long, dark hair. She does not threaten with violence, but with knowledge, a deep, intimate knowledge of the officers she encounters, calling them by name, referencing their past, their families, their losses. Over the past decade, a pattern has emerged. These encounters are not random. They follow specific geographic and temporal paths. They leave behind evidence that is both tangible and impossible: footprints that span impossible distances, objects that vanish and reappear, radio recordings of voices that should not be there, and they leave behind a trail of officers whose careers and sometimes their lives are irrevocably altered. This is the forensic documentation of a phenomenon that operates just beyond the edge of explanation. It is a record of what happens when the modern world of law enforcement collides with the ancient, unknowable forces of the land it is sworn to protect. Now let us begin with our first story. It was late November of 2014, a time when the high desert of the Navajo Nation turns cold at night, the air thin and sharp as glass. Officer Michael Begay had been with the Navajo Nation Police Department for 7 years, patrolling the remote district that covered the area between Kayenta and Monument Valley. He was a man comfortable with solitude, a quality essential for the job. His shifts often involved hours of driving through empty landscapes, the only sounds the hum of his cruiser's engine and the crackle of the radio. On this particular night, the moon was a thin crescent, hanging above the desert like a sliver of bone, offering just enough light to etch the mesas and buttes in silver and black. Begay's routine was second nature: a thermos of strong black coffee, a constant scan of the horizon, a rhythmic check-in with dispatch every hour, his call sign, 714, spoken into the microphone with practiced calm. The night had been uneventful, the radio quiet except for the occasional chatter between other units miles away. He was driving south on Highway 163, a desolate stretch of road that cuts through the desert toward the iconic backdrop of Monument Valley. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. when his headlights caught something at the edge of the road, just past the wide shoulder that gave way to scrubland and sand. At first, his mind classified it as animal, a coyote perhaps, or a stray horse from one of the nearby homesteads. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something undeniably human, a figure standing perfectly still, facing away from the road toward the vast, empty expanse of the desert. It was a woman, wearing what appeared to be a traditional manta dress, the dark woolen fabric blending with the night. Her posture was unnaturally still, a statue carved from shadow and moonlight. Begay slowed the cruiser, his foot easing off the accelerator as his training and curiosity warred within him. He reached for the spotlight control, his thumb hovering over the button. "Ma'am? Is everything all right?" He called through his open window, his voice sounding small and lost in the immense silence. The figure did not move. It did not turn or acknowledge his presence. Begay brought the cruiser to a stop 100 feet away, the engine idling. He switched on his spotlight, the powerful beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the woman. The light revealed details he hadn't seen before: the intricate silver and turquoise concho belt at her waist, the thickness of her dark hair that fell well past her waist, unbound and heavy. The light seemed to pass through her slightly, or perhaps it was just a trick of the dust motes dancing in the beam. He opened his door, the sound of the latch echoing in the stillness. "Ma'am, this is Officer Begay with Navajo Nation Police. You need to turn around. There's nothing out there." He stepped out of his vehicle, the crunch of his boots on the gravel shoulder the only sound. The air was cold, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. He approached slowly, his hand resting near the butt of his service weapon, a precaution born of habit, not of any specific sense of threat. There was no threat here, only a profound and unsettling wrongness. As he closed the distance to within 30 feet, the woman turned. The movement was not a normal turn of the body. It was a slow, mechanical pivot, as if she were mounted on an unseen axis. Her face remained in shadow, completely obscured by the curtain of her hair, which did not move despite the faint, cold breeze that stirred Begay's uniform. That's when he heard it, not through his ears, but inside his head. It was a whisper, yet it was as clear as a spoken word, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in the cavity of his skull. "Michael Begay." His blood ran cold. He froze, his hand now gripping the handle of his weapon. She knew his name. He hadn't identified himself beyond his title, yet she spoke his full name with perfect, unnerving clarity. The voice was feminine, but it held an ancient quality, a resonance that felt older than the rocks surrounding them. He drew his service weapon, the smooth click of the holster releasing the pistol sounding loud and final. Training took over, a desperate anchor in a sea of impossibility. "Step into the light, where I can see you," he commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor that had started in his hands and was working its way up his arms. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The woman tilted her head, a gesture that seemed both curious and predatory. The movement was jerky, like a puppet's. Then she began walking toward him, not on the road, but somehow gliding just above it. Her feet, clad in moccasins he could now see, were at least 2 inches from the ground. She moved forward in a smooth, unhurried approach, covering the distance between them with an impossible grace. Begay backed away, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. He fumbled for his radio, his fingers suddenly clumsy. "Dispatch, this is 714. I need backup at mile marker 23 on Highway 163. I have a 1057. The code for a suspicious person felt woefully inadequate. The whisper came again, clearer this time, like breath against his ear, though she was still 20 feet away. "You shouldn't have come here tonight, Michael. He holstered his weapon, a decision driven by a primal instinct that a gun would be useless against this. He retreated to his cruiser, not taking his eyes off the approaching figure. He scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it. The sound of the locks engaging was a small, pathetic comfort. He looked up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The woman was gone. There was no swirl of dust, no sound of departure. She was simply no longer there. He scanned the desert with his spotlight, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing. No footprints in the sand, no trace she had ever been there. The only evidence of the encounter was the pounding of his heart and the cold sweat that had soaked through his uniform shirt. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with the echo of that voice, Begay filed a report. He described a possible intoxicated female at mile marker 23 who had fled on foot. He made no mention of the floating woman or the voice that knew his name. When his supervisor, Sergeant Yazzie, asked why he'd called for backup in the middle of nowhere for a simple public intoxication call, Begay claimed he'd seen what looked like a weapon in her hand. Yazzie looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable before nodding and filing the report. 3 weeks later, Officer Thomas Yazzie, the sergeant's nephew, was found dead in his cruiser at the same mile marker, an apparent heart attack. In his lapel microphone recording, which had been accidentally activated during his final moments, a woman's voice could be heard whispering his name just before his breathing stopped. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but the recording was quietly archived and the case file was marked closed without further investigation. No trace of the woman was ever found. Hundreds of miles away, in the Crown Point district, another officer was about to discover that silence can be deafening. The Crown Point district spanned over 2,000 square miles of high desert plains, mesas, and canyons in the eastern portion of Navajo Nation. It was a landscape of extremes, scorching summers that could push the mercury past 110 degrees, and winters that brought bone-chilling winds and occasional snow that transformed the red earth into a foreign white terrain. The district office, a modest cinder block building with a radio tower rising beside it like a metal sentinel, served as the hub for law enforcement across this vast territory. Inside, the walls were lined with maps, wanted posters, and photographs of officers who had come and gone over the decades. Officer Janet So had been assigned to Crown Point for 3 years, transferring from the more urban Window Rock district, seeking what she thought would be a quieter posting. At 34, she was a single mother to an 8-year-old daughter named Maya, who lived with her sister in Gallup during the school week for better educational opportunities. This arrangement allowed So to work the graveyard shift without worrying about childcare, though it meant she only saw her daughter on weekends. So was a pragmatist by nature, a woman who had joined the force not out of some childhood dream of wearing a badge, but for the steady paycheck and comprehensive health benefits that would ensure Maya received the medical care she needed for her asthma. She believed in what she could see, touch, and document: the scuff marks on a broken door, the precise measurements of a crime scene, the clear evidence that led to convictions. The supernatural stories that occasionally circulated among officers were, to her, nothing more than entertainment for long nights, campfire tales that grew in the telling. So had heard the whispers about the whispering woman circulating around the station for months. In the close-knit world of tribal law enforcement, stories traveled fast, carried on the same radio waves they used to do their jobs. The tale had begun with Officer Michael Begay's strange encounter near Monument Valley in 2014, and had since spread through every district in Navajo Nation. Each retelling added new details, new encounters, new officers who had experienced something they couldn't explain. Some spoke of a woman who appeared on deserted highways, her feet never touching the ground. Others mentioned radio interference that wasn't static, but whispers in an ancient dialect of Navajo. Most unsettling were the accounts of the entity knowing officers' names, personal details no stranger could possibly know. So had dismissed these stories as exactly what they appeared to be: myths that filled the long hours between calls, legends that gave voice to the isolation and darkness that came with the job. That changed in March of 2016, on a night that began like any other. Tso reported for duty at 5:45 p.m., her uniform crisp despite the day's heat, her service weapon holstered at her hip, her hair pulled back in a tight bun that regulation required. The shift briefing was unremarkable. Sergeant Yazzie, a man who had served the department for over 20 years, reviewed the active cases, reminded everyone of the new procedures for evidence documentation, and wished them a safe shift. Tso drew the keys to Cruiser 523, a 2012 Ford Crown Victoria with 87,000 miles on the odometer and a persistent squeak in the driver's side door that maintenance never seemed to fix. She performed her pre-shift inspection methodically, checking the emergency equipment, verifying the radio was functioning correctly, ensuring the shotgun was secured in its rack. Everything was in order. The first 6 hours of her shift passed with the routine monotony that she had come to expect. She responded to a minor traffic accident on Route 371, where a teenager had rear-ended an elderly woman's pickup truck. Both drivers were uninjured, though the teenager's insurance was clearly expired. Tso issued the appropriate citation and called for a tow truck, her report written with the detached precision she was known for at the department. Later, she conducted a wellness check on an elderly woman who lived alone in a small trailer home off the main highway. The woman's daughter in Albuquerque had called dispatch when she couldn't reach her mother for 2 days. The woman, Mrs. Nez, was more annoyed than grateful to see a police officer at her door, explaining that her phone battery had died and she had been busy preparing traditional medicines. Tso documented the visit, noting that Mrs. Nez appeared to be in good health and required no assistance. At 1:30 a.m., Tso stopped at the Allsup's convenience store in Crown Point for coffee and a bathroom break. The night clerk, a young man named Kevin who worked the graveyard shift to put himself through community college, nodded as she entered. They exchanged brief pleasantries, Tso asking about his classes, Kevin commenting on how quiet the night had been. As she paid for her coffee, Tso noticed a group of young men gathered near the entrance, their conversation falling silent as she approached. She recognized one of them as a teenager she had cited for underage drinking the previous month. Their eyes followed her as she left, the weight of their gaze making the hair on her neck prickle. She made a mental note to mention the gathering to the day shift officer who would relieve her in the morning. The Crown Point district was a mix of small towns and vast, empty spaces, and Tso's patrol covered a large swath of it. After leaving the convenience store, she drove south on Route 371, a lonely 2-lane highway that cut through the high desert plains like a scar. The landscape was moonlit and monochrome, the mesas standing like ancient sentinels against the star-filled sky. Tso's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the occasional reflective markers on the side of the road and the eyes of nocturnal animals that scurried away from her approaching vehicle. The cruiser's cab was filled with the low thrum of the engine and the hiss of the wind outside, sounds that had become so familiar to Tso they were almost comforting. At 3:42 a.m., dispatch called her about a possible domestic disturbance at a remote residence off Route 371. The caller had hung up immediately, but the address was logged, a small homestead near the Bisti Dana Zin wilderness area, about 30 miles from her current location. Tso acknowledged the call, noting in her log that she was responding, though she was the closest unit and backup would be at least 20 minutes away. As she drove toward the location, the coffee warming her hands, she mentally reviewed the procedure for domestic calls, approach cautiously, assess the situation before entering, request backup if there were any signs of violence or intoxication. That's when it started. Her radio, which had been quiet between dispatch transmissions, began to emit strange sounds. It wasn't static, not the familiar crackle of a bad signal or the occasional interference from atmospheric conditions. It was a faint whispering, and it seemed to be in the Diné language. Tso was fluent in Navajo, having grown up speaking it with her grandparents in the small community of Sheep Springs. But this dialect sounded ancient, almost unrecognizable. The cadence was wrong. The words formed in a way that felt archaic, as if she were hearing a language that had been preserved in amber for centuries and was only now being released into the modern world. She could make out only fragments at first, words that sent a chill down her spine despite the warm night air blowing through the vents. Ya-te. Hello. Ah-hey-hey. Thank you. And then something that made her grip the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. I am. The voice was a whisper, yet it cut through the radio hiss with chilling clarity. It was a woman's voice, the same ancient quality she had dismissed in the stories her colleagues told around the break room table. So reached for the radio dial, adjusting the frequency, but the whispering persisted, now seeming to come from multiple channels at once, a chorus of whispers that overlapped and intertwined in a way that made no logical sense. So keyed her microphone. Dispatch, this is 523. I'm experiencing some kind of interference on my end. How do you read? The reply came back clear and strong, cutting through the whispers for a moment before they resumed. Negative, 523. You're coming in 5 by 5. No interference on our end. So frowned, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. She had been with the department long enough to know that radio interference was usually explainable. Solar flares, atmospheric conditions, faulty equipment. But this was different. The whispers seemed to respond to her voice, growing clearer when she spoke, as if they were trying to communicate with her specifically. She considered turning back to the station to have the radio checked, but the domestic call took priority. Protocol dictated that she respond to all potential disturbances, even if they turned out to be false alarms. As she continued driving, the whispers became more distinct, forming phrases that seemed to hover just beyond her comprehension. She caught words like hoju, balance and harmony, iaina, life, and du da inida, it's not going to be good. The phrases seemed disconnected, random, yet there was an underlying pattern that she couldn't quite grasp. Like a melody without a recognizable rhythm, the radio continued to function normally for official communications, cutting to silence when dispatch spoke, then resuming the whispering when the channel was clear. It was as if two separate signals were sharing the same frequency, one official and one something else. The landscape grew more remote as she approached the turnoff to the residence, a dirt road marked only by a rusted mailbox that leaned at an unnatural angle, as if tired from decades of standing in the relentless wind. The homestead was another 10 miles down this dirt road, a journey that would take at least 20 minutes in the cruiser. So slowed as she approached the turnoff, her headlights sweeping across the desolate terrain. That's when she saw it. A figure standing by the side of the main highway, just beyond the rusted mailbox. At first, Tso thought it might be someone whose car had broken down, a common occurrence on this stretch of highway, where cell service was non-existent and help could be hours away. But as her headlights illuminated the figure, she felt a cold dread wash over her. It was a woman in traditional Navajo clothing, a dark manta dress that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, falling like a curtain around her head and shoulders. Tso's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the stories, but seeing it with her own eyes was something else entirely. The figure was standing perfectly still, just like in Begay's report from 2 years earlier, a report Tso had dismissed as stress-induced hallucination. Tso slowed her vehicle, her professional demeanor warring with a rising tide of dread. She reached for her spotlight, intending to illuminate the figure properly, but her hand froze halfway there. There was something wrong with how the woman stood, something that defied the natural order. So noted, with a detached sense of horror, that the woman's feet appeared not to touch the ground. They seemed to hover an inch or two above the dusty shoulder of the road, an impossibility that made no sense in the physical world as Tso understood it. The whispers in her radio grew louder, more distinct, forming words that seemed to bypass the speaker and go directly into her mind. Janet Tso, they said, her name spoken with perfect clarity. The syllables formed in the ancient dialect that moments before had been nearly incomprehensible. It is time to come home. Tso slammed her foot on the accelerator, the cruiser lurching forward with a squeal of tires on asphalt. She did not stop at the reported disturbance. She did not even take the turnoff. She drove straight, her foot pressed to the floor, the landscape blurring past her windows. The domestic call, the protocol, the procedures she had followed for years, all of it forgotten in the face of this impossible encounter. Her mind was racing, replaying the words. It is time to come home. Home to where? To her daughter, who was staying with her sister, or to some other place, some other concept of home that this entity represented. The fear was no longer abstract. It was personal, targeted. This thing, whatever it was, knew her name. The whispers continued as she drove, now seeming to come from inside the vehicle rather than through the radio speakers. Your daughter is safe, they said, as if reading her thoughts. For now. The implied threat sent a fresh wave of terror through Tso's body. She pressed the accelerator harder, the cruiser's engine screaming in protest. The speedometer climbed past 80, then 90 miles per hour, dangerous speeds on this winding highway at night. But Tso didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between herself and the figure that stood by the road, a figure she knew with certainty was still watching her, even though she didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. She drove 20 miles out of her way, taking a route that would lead her to Gallup rather than back to Crown Point. The town lights appeared in the distance like a promise of safety, a beacon of normalcy in a night that had become anything but. Tso didn't head to the police station or her small apartment on the edge of town. Instead, she drove to her mother's house on the south side, a modest single-story home with a small garden in the front yard where her mother grew corn and squash in the summer months. She pulled into the driveway, killing the engine and the lights, plunging the cab into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening after the roar of the engine and the whispers that had haunted her radio. Tso sat there for a moment, her heart pounding, trying to steady her breathing. The digital clock on the dashboard read 4:17 a.m. In just a few hours, the sun would rise, and this night would seem like a bad dream, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many hours alone in the dark. But Tso knew it wasn't a dream. The fear was too real, too visceral. When she got out of the cruiser, her legs felt weak, barely able to support her weight. She fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the front door. As she stepped inside, the front door opened, and her mother was standing there, wrapped in a bathrobe, a look of deep concern on her face. Tso's mother, a woman in her late 60s who rarely woke before sunrise, was wide awake, as if she had been waiting for her daughter's arrival. "I was worried about you," her mother said in Navajo, her voice soft but firm. "I had a dream that a woman with no face came to tell me you were in danger. She said you were driving toward a dark place, and I had to leave the light on for you." Tso broke down, the events of the night crashing down on her with the force of a physical blow. She sank to her knees on the welcome mat, her body shaking with sobs she couldn't control. Her mother knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around Tso's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort in the language of her childhood. For the first time since she had joined the force, Tso felt not like a police officer, but like a child again, seeking protection from a mother who seemed to possess knowledge that transcended the natural world. The next day, Tso submitted a formal request for a transfer to the day shift. On the form, under Reason for Request, she wrote simply, "Family considerations." She didn't mention the radio interference, the figure by the side of the road, the voice that knew her name. How could she? Who would believe her? They would think she was unstable, unfit for duty. Her career would be over. So she kept silent, burying the terror deep inside herself, where it would fester like a wound that refused to heal. Her request was approved without question, processed by Sergeant Yazzie, who gave her a look of grim understanding, as if he knew more than he was letting on. "Sometimes the night shift gets to people," he said, his voice gentle. "It's good that you're putting your family first." Tso nodded, unable to meet his eyes, afraid he would see the truth there. The officer who took her place on the graveyard shift, a young man named Robert Charlie, had been with the department for just over a year. He was eager, ambitious, and dismissive of the superstitious nonsense that some of the older officers indulged in. Tso tried to warn him, to suggest he be careful on Route 371, but he laughed it off. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said, with a confidence that So remembered having once herself. 2 weeks later, Robert Charlie resigned. His resignation letter cited personal reasons, but before he left, he filed a report about unexplained radio transmissions and a female figure that appeared to float above the ground, near the same stretch of Route 371 where Tso had encountered the whispering woman. The report was filed away, marked as unexplained, and Robert Charlie was never seen on the reservation again. The radio in his patrol vehicle was found to be in perfect working order, with no evidence of interference or malfunction. Tso heard about his resignation secondhand from an officer who had processed his final paperwork. She never saw Charlie again, but sometimes when she was driving home after her day shift ended, she would look toward the east, toward the desolate highway where she had left a part of herself behind, and she would wonder how many others had heard the whispers, how many others had fled into the daylight, leaving the night to whatever it was that waited there in the darkness. In the summer of 2017, the heat settled over the Navajo Nation like a heavy blanket. The days were blistering, the nights offering only a slight, dusty reprieve. It was during this season that Officer Benjamin Chi was called to investigate a report that, on the surface, seemed mundane. The caller was an elderly sheepherder named John Holliday, a man in his late 70s who had lived on the same remote homestead near the Arizona-Utah border his entire life. He reported that someone had been walking around his property at night, leaving tracks that started and ended abruptly in the middle of his yard. Chi arrived at midday, the sun beating down on the red earth, creating heat shimmers that distorted the horizon. Holliday was waiting for him, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes narrowed against the glare. He was a man of few words, but his demeanor was one of genuine unease. He pointed to a series of prints that circled his small dwelling, a simple cinderblock house with a tin roof. What made them unusual was immediately apparent to Chi, even before he knelt to examine them. Their spacing was impossible. Each print was exactly 8 feet apart, far beyond any human's or animal's stride. "Nobody can jump that far," Holliday explained in Navajo, switching to English when he noticed Chi's confusion. "And they don't sink into the ground like a person would. It's like whoever made them weighs nothing at all." Chi photographed the prints, his camera clicking in the oppressive silence. He noted their distinctive pattern. They were barefoot, with toes that seemed unusually long and slender. He used a tape measure to confirm Holliday's observation. 8 feet between each step, with mathematical precision. The prints formed a perfect circle around the dwelling, with no entrance or exit point. It was as if whoever or whatever made them had materialized in one spot, walked in a perfect circle, and then dematerialized. As Chi was documenting the evidence, making notes in his small, weathered notebook, he noticed something else that made the hair on his arms stand up, despite the suffocating heat. Among the large, adult-sized prints were smaller ones, the size of a child's, that appeared exactly halfway between each adult print. It was as if someone was carrying a child while taking impossibly long strides. The child's prints were too perfect, too clean, as if they had been pressed into the dirt by a delicate, weightless foot. Holliday offered Chi a glass of water and invited him inside, out of the punishing sun. The interior of the small house was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and herbs. On the wall hung several family photographs, including one of Holliday with his wife and 2 young children, a boy and a girl. "My wife died 10 years ago, Holliday said, noticing Chi looking at the photo. "Cancer. My son moved to the city, Phoenix. He works in a bank now." He paused, his gaze lingering on the photograph. "My daughter, she disappeared 25 years ago. Walked out into the desert one night and never came back. They searched for days, the police, the volunteers. But they found nothing, no trace. It's like the earth just swallowed her." Chi felt a sudden chill despite the heat. "What was your daughter's name?" "Sarah," Holliday replied, his voice quiet. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Chi said, though his mind was racing. He had noticed something about the child-sized footprints that had bothered him from the start. They were too small to belong to a human child, more like the prints a toddler might make. Yet they were perfectly formed, with the same unusually long toes as the adult prints. And there was something else, a detail he had almost missed. Near the child's prints, the dirt was disturbed in a way that suggested the dragging of a blanket or a piece of cloth. That night, as Chi was typing his report at the station in Kayenta, the quiet hum of the computers the only sound, he heard a whisper beside him, so close he felt a displacement of air. "Tell my father I miss him." He spun around, his chair scraping the floor. There was no one there. The station was empty except for him. The whisper had been clear, a child's voice, filled with a longing that pierced him to the core. He knew with a certainty that defied all logic and training that it was Sarah Holliday. The next morning, before his shift was over, he drove back to Holliday's property. The footprints were gone, erased by the wind and the fine red dust that constantly shifted across the landscape. There was no sign they had ever been there. Chi never filed the full report. He wrote a brief note about a misunderstanding regarding animal tracks and closed the case. He couldn't bring himself to tell the old man what he had heard, what he suspected. It felt too sacred, too private. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something that defied explanation, a reunion between a father and the daughter he had lost decades ago, marked by footprints that shouldn't exist. A few weeks later, Chi heard that John Holliday had passed away in his sleep. A neighbor found him in his bed, a peaceful smile on his face, one hand resting on a small, child-sized moccasin that had never been there before. No trace of the footprints or the moccasin was ever recorded in any official log. The discovery of Officer Daniel Nez's patrol car on the morning of October 31, 2018, remains one of the most baffling and disturbing cases in Navajo Nation police history. The vehicle was found at the bottom of a ravine off Route 12, a desolate highway that winds through the Painted Desert. The engine was still running, a low, guttural idle that seemed to mock the silence of the surrounding landscape. The headlights were on, cutting a tunnel of light through the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating the red rock wall 20 feet away where the car had finally come to a rest. Officer Daniel Nez was gone. The call came in at 5:48 a.m. A road crew member, arriving early to start his shift, had seen the headlights from the main road and investigated, finding the cruiser wedged among the juniper and scrub oak at the base of the embankment. Search and rescue was mobilized immediately, but as the sun rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desert, the scope of the mystery became clear. Nez was not in the car. He was not anywhere near it. Search parties combed the area for days. His fellow officers, family members, and volunteers from the community walked shoulder to shoulder, covering every inch of the rugged terrain. They used drones, tracking dogs, and all the technology at their disposal. They found no sign of him, no tracks leading away from the vehicle, no discarded clothing, no indication that he had left the car under his own power or been taken by force. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. What they did find was recorded on the cruiser's dash camera and Nez's body microphone. The footage shows Nez driving along the deserted highway at 11:47 p.m. He is humming softly to himself, a habit his wife had always teased him about. The road is empty. Suddenly, he brakes hard, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The camera captures a figure standing in the middle of the road, a woman in traditional Navajo clothing, her face completely obscured by long, dark hair that hangs like a shroud. Nez exits the vehicle, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. "Ma'am, you need to move off the roadway," he says, his voice calm and professional, the voice of a trained officer. "This is a dangerous place to be standing." The woman doesn't respond. She doesn't even flinch at the bright light in her eyes. Instead, she begins walking toward the cruiser, not on the road, but somehow gliding inches above it. Nez backs away, his hand moving to the butt of his service weapon. The tension is visible even on the grainy footage. "Stop right there," he commands, his voice now edged with urgency. "Identify yourself, Navajo Nation Police. The woman continues her approach, her movement unnervingly smooth and silent. Nez can be heard breathing heavily, his professional demeanor giving way to a raw, primal fear. Dispatch. This is 809. I have a 1057 at mile marker 42 on Route 12. Requesting immediate backup. Subject is non-compliant. Then comes the voice, not through Nez's radio, but captured with chilling clarity on his body microphone. It's a whisper that seems to come from all directions at once, a sound that seems to vibrate in the very air. Daniel Nez, we have been waiting for you. Nez gasps, a sharp, audible intake of breath. Who are you? How do you know my name? The whisper continues, now forming words in the ancient Navajo dialect that only a few elders still spoke. Nez, who had grown up hearing his grandmother tell stories in the old language, understands every word. His face, illuminated by his own flashlight, goes pale. You have something that belongs to us, the turquoise, the silver, the memories. Nez's breathing becomes ragged, panicked. I don't know what you're talking about. The necklace you wear, it was taken from our family. Your grandmother found it near the canyon where my daughter fell. It has been calling to me, calling me home. Nez reaches for his throat, his fingers fumbling with the clasp of the turquoise necklace he always wore, a gift from his grandmother, who had found it years ago while herding sheep in a remote canyon. She had told him it was a lucky find, a beautiful piece lost by some unknown person. He had worn it every day since she passed away. The dash camera shows Nez lowering his weapon, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of utter defeat. He seems to shrink, the fight draining out of him. He walks toward the woman, his hand outstretched as if to remove the necklace and return it. The footage ends as he reaches her, the camera cutting to black as the patrol car, now driverless, rolls slowly down the embankment. The last sound captured is Nez's final, whispered, "Ah hey hey." Thank you. Daniel Nez was never seen again. The official report, filed after a month-long investigation, lists him as missing, presumed deceased. His patrol vehicle was recovered from the ravine, engine still running, the driver's side door hanging open. The turquoise necklace was found on the ground nearby, its silver clasp broken as if it had been torn away in haste. The official narrative was that Nez had suffered a medical emergency, a sudden cardiac event, and had stumbled out of his vehicle before it went over the edge. But the officers who reviewed the dashcam footage knew better. They had seen his face. They had heard the voice. They knew he had walked into the darkness willingly. No other trace of him was ever found. In the cold, clear light of a January morning in 2019, Officer Lucy Thompson received a call that would challenge her pragmatic view of the world in a way no crime scene ever had. She was summoned to the primary school in Shiprock, New Mexico, a place of bright murals and the sound of children's laughter. The call was from the school principal, a woman whose voice was tight with a concern that went beyond a typical school discipline issue. A teacher had reported unusual behavior from one of her second-grade students, a 7-year-old named Tyler Begay. Thompson arrived to find the school in a state of quiet unease. The principal led her down a hallway to classroom 2B. The room was empty, the small chairs and desks pushed into neat rows. In the center of the room, at a small table, sat Tyler Begay. He was hunched over a notebook, a crayon clutched in his fist, moving with an intensity that was unsettling in a child so young. He was drawing, but he wasn't doodling. His movements were precise, deliberate, as if he were copying an image that only he could see. The teacher, a young woman named Ms. Gorman, stood by the door, her arms wrapped around herself. "He's been like that since recess started," she whispered. "He wouldn't go outside. He just sat down and started drawing. He won't talk to anyone. He won't even look up." Thompson approached the table slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. "Tyler," she said softly, "everything okay?" The child didn't look up, but he spoke, and the voice that came out was not the high-pitched voice of a 7-year-old boy. It was lower, flatter, and resonated with an ancient cadence that made the fine hairs on Thompson's arms stand up. "She says you shouldn't have come here today, Officer Thompson." Thompson froze, her hand halfway to her radio. "Who says that, Tyler?" "The whispering woman," the child replied, his focus never leaving the page. The crayon continued its smooth, practiced strokes. "She's been visiting me at night, in my dreams. She says she knows all the police officers. She says you're looking for something you lost." Thompson felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the classroom's faulty heating. She had never told anyone about the silver bracelet she had lost while hiking near Canyon de Chelly 2 months earlier. It had been her grandmother's, a family heirloom she had worn every day since her grandmother's passing. She had searched for it for hours, her heart heavy with the loss, but it was gone. "What else does she tell you?" Thompson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyler looked up from his drawing, and Thompson had to stop herself from gasping. His eyes, normally a warm brown, seemed darker, older, ancient even. They held a knowledge that was impossible, a wisdom that was not his own. "She says she knows where your bracelet is. She says she'll give it back if you do something for her." "What does she want?" Thompson asked, her training forgotten, her world tilting on its axis. The child smiled, a gesture that seemed wrong on his young face, a stretching of the lips that didn't reach his ancient eyes. "She wants you to stop looking for Officer Nez. She says he's with her now. He's happy. He's with his grandmother." Thompson backed away, her hand now on her radio, her mind reeling. Daniel Nez, the officer who had vanished 2 months earlier. His case was still open, a cold knot of unanswered questions. As she called for assistance, her voice shaking as she requested an immediate unit for a welfare check, Tyler returned to his drawing. He was drawing rapidly now, the crayon flying across the page. When help arrived 5 minutes later, it was Officer Benjamin Chi who responded. He found Thompson standing in the doorway, her face pale, her body rigid. Tyler was gone. The classroom was empty. But his notebook remained open on the desk. Chi walked over and looked down at the drawing the boy had been working on. It showed Thompson herself, standing at the edge of a canyon, the same one where she had lost her bracelet. In the drawing, she was reaching down into the darkness, where a silver bracelet glinted in the moonlight. Standing behind her, a hand resting gently on her shoulder, was the shadowy figure of the whispering woman, her face a blank void, her long hair like a dark waterfall. The next day, Thompson, against the advice of Chi and her superiors, drove to Canyon de Chelly. She hiked to the spot where she had lost her bracelet, a place where the trail narrowed and the drop was sheer. There, wedged between 2 rocks at the very edge of the trail, almost hidden in the shadows, was the silver bracelet, gleaming in the morning sun as if it had been placed there for her to find. As she reached for it, her fingers trembling, she heard a whisper on the wind, seeming to come from the canyon depths below. It was a single word, spoken in the same ancient dialect from the child's lips. "Ah, hey, thank you." Thompson grabbed the bracelet and ran, not stopping until she was safely back in her vehicle, the doors locked, the engine racing. Tyler Begay never returned to school. His family told authorities that he had gone to stay with relatives in another state, though no one could provide an address. The only thing left behind was his notebook, filled with page after page of drawings of the whispering woman and the officers she had visited. No trace of Tyler or his family was ever found by school officials or social services. The old trading post had been abandoned for decades, its weathered wood and corrugated roof slowly surrendering to the relentless wind and sun. Located 20 miles from the nearest paved road, it had once served as a hub for the surrounding community, a place where locals could trade wool and crafts for supplies, a place where stories were shared as much as goods. Now it stood empty, a relic of a bygone era, its windows like vacant eyes staring out across the empty desert. Officer Jake Wilson had passed the trading post countless times during his patrols, but had never stopped. It was just another landmark on a long, monotonous route. That changed in April of 2019 when he received a call about trespassers. A rancher, a man named Manuelito, reported seeing lights inside the building late at night, flickering like candles, though there was no electricity connected to the structure and hadn't been for 50 years. Wilson arrived at dusk, the setting sun a bleeding wound on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. As he approached the trading post, he noticed that the front door, which had been securely boarded up for years, stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the fading light. He drew his flashlight and weapon, the familiar weight a small comfort. He pushed the door open with his foot, the screech of rusty hinges echoing in the profound silence. The interior was thick with the smell of dust and decay, a century of forgotten things. Every surface was covered in a fine layer of grit, except for a series of footprints that led from the entrance to the back room. Wilson followed them carefully, his flashlight beam tracking the prints in the dust. They were bare, with toes that seemed unusually long. They were fresh, the edges sharp, despite the lack of rain or wind in weeks. In the back room, a storeroom filled with rusted cans and empty crates, Wilson found what appeared to be a makeshift altar. Several items were arranged with meticulous care on a long wooden counter. A small, worn child's shoe, a silver bracelet, identical to the one Lucy Thompson had described, a turquoise necklace with a broken clasp, and a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young Navajo woman. The photograph was old, but Wilson could make out the woman's features: high cheekbones, dark, knowing eyes, and impossibly long hair that fell past her waist. It was the face from the stories, the face from Tyler Begay's drawings. As Wilson examined the items, his gloved fingers tracing the silver of the bracelet, he heard a sound from the front of the building, the soft, definitive click of a door closing. He rushed back to the main room, weapon raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was empty. The front door was now closed, though he was certain he had left it open when he entered. The air was still, heavy with a silence that felt like a presence. Wilson called for backup, his voice tight, the words clipped. "Dispatch, 821. I need backup at the old Larson trading post. I have signs of forced entry and possible intruder." As he waited, the beam of his flashlight playing across the darkened room, he noticed something on the wall behind the counter, hidden in the shadows. He walked closer and felt his blood run cold. Carved into the wood was a series of names, some recent, the wood still pale beneath, others dating back years, darkened with age. Among them were names he recognized from whispered conversations and half-forgotten reports: Michael Begay, Janet Tso, Benjamin Chi, Daniel Nez, Lucy Thompson. And at the bottom of the list, freshly carved, the wood shaving still on the floor, was his own name: Jake Wilson. When backup arrived 10 minutes later, it was Sergeant Yazzie who found him. Wilson was standing in the middle of the room, his weapon lowered, staring at the wall of names as if in a trance. The footprints were gone, erased as if they had never been there. The makeshift altar on the counter was gone. The trading post was once again just an empty, dusty building, filled with nothing but the ghosts of old merchandise. The only evidence of what Wilson had seen was the newly carved name on the wall. The next day, Wilson submitted a request for a transfer to a different district, citing extreme personal stress. His request was approved without question, processed by the same sergeant who had approved Janet Tso's transfer. Before leaving, Wilson drove past the trading post one last time. The building appeared exactly as it had for years, boarded up, abandoned, with no sign that anyone had been inside. The door was securely shut. He never spoke of what he saw that night, but he began carrying a small medicine bag given to him by his grandmother, filled with herbs and protective charms. He never again patrolled alone after dark, always requesting a partner for his shifts, a request that was never denied. The name on the wall, however, remained, a silent testament to his encounter, a permanent addition to the list. On a cold December night in 2020, the kind of night where the stars seemed so close you could almost touch them, Officer Maria Martinez was patrolling the remote stretch of highway between Gallup and Window Rock. The landscape was monochrome under the moonlight, a world of black rock and white snow. The night was so quiet that the hum of her cruiser's tires on the asphalt seemed like a violation. At 1:17 a.m., her radio went silent. It wasn't just that no one was talking. It was dead. The indicator light was on, showing it had power, but no sound came through, not even the low-level hiss of an open channel. It was a profound, unnatural silence, a void in the place where there should have been connection. Martinez tried all channels, including the emergency frequency, but received no response. She was alone in the darkness, her cruiser a tiny island of light in an immense, frozen ocean. The dashboard clock read 1:17 a.m. when she saw the figure standing at the edge of the road. It was a woman wearing what appeared to be a traditional manta dress, her back to Martinez. Martinez slowed the cruiser, her breath fogging in the cold air. She reached for her spotlight, her fingers feeling stiff and clumsy. As the beam of light hit the figure, Martinez felt a sudden deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The woman was standing in a drift of snow, but her feet left no impression. The woman turned, and Martinez saw that her face was obscured by long, dark hair that seemed to move despite the absence of wind. That's when Martinez heard the whisper not through her dead radio, but inside her head, a voice that was as clear and cold as the winter air. "Maria Martinez, we have been waiting for you." Martinez's blood ran cold. She put the cruiser in reverse, backing away from the figure, her eyes wide with a fear she had never known. The woman began walking toward the vehicle, not on the road, but somehow gliding just above it, her feet leaving no tracks in the fresh snow. Martinez fumbled for her cell phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. The screen was black. It was dead, though it had been fully charged when she started her shift just 6 hours ago. The whisper came again, clearer this time, seeming to come from right beside her, though the woman was still 20 feet away. "You carry something that belongs to us." The photograph. The memory. Martinez glanced at the dashboard, where a photograph of her and her 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, was taped to the vent. It had been taken at a school carnival 2 years ago, Sophia smiling widely, missing her 2 front teeth, Martinez's arm around her shoulders, a rare, genuine smile on her own face. "Your daughter looks so much like mine," the whisper continued, the voice filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight. "Same eyes, same smile. She misses you, doesn't she? The way my mother missed me." Martinez felt tears welling in her eyes, blurring the figure outside. Her daughter was staying with her ex-husband in Phoenix, 100 miles away. They hadn't spoken in weeks, not since their last argument about Martinez's job, about the hours she kept, about the dangers she faced. Sophia had cried, begging her to quit. "I don't want you to end up like Daniel Nez," she had said. "She needs you," the whisper said, now seeming to come from the passenger seat beside Martinez, though she was alone in the car. "And you need her. Go to her. Now. Before it's too late. Before the road claims you too." Martinez put the cruiser in drive and accelerated, not stopping until she was miles away from the figure, the snow swirling in her wake. When she looked in her rearview mirror, the road behind her was empty, a white ribbon disappearing into the darkness. Her radio suddenly came to life, bursting with sound, dispatch calling her name, her voice frantic. 8:31, do you copy? We've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. Are you okay? We lost your transponder signal." Martinez pulled over, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the microphone. "I'm fine, dispatch," she said, her voice cracking. "Just some radio interference, a dead zone." Without waiting for a response, she turned the cruiser around and drove toward Phoenix, abandoning her post for the first time in her 8-year career. She drove through the night, the whisper echoing in her mind, a counterpoint to the hum of the engine. She arrived at her ex-husband's house as the sun was rising, casting a pink and orange glow over the suburban street. She found Sophia sitting on the front steps, still in her pajamas, waiting for her. "I had a dream about you last night," her daughter said, hugging Martinez so tightly she could barely breathe. "A woman came to me. She had long, dark hair and she was so sad. She said you were in danger. She said you needed to come home." Maria Martinez never returned to her job with the Navajo Nation Police. She resigned the following week, citing irreconcilable family obligations. She and her daughter moved to a small town in Colorado, far from the desert highways and the whispers that seemed to ride the wind. She left behind her career, her home, and the life she had known. But she never forgot the voice that knew her daughter's name, the voice that had sent her home. No trace of the radio malfunction was ever found by the department's mechanics. Officer Michael Begay had heard the stories, of course. Every officer on the force had. The whispering woman, the floating figure who knew their names, who appeared when least expected, who left behind more questions than answers. He had even been the first, back in 2014, to have a documented encounter with her. But in the 7 years since that night on Highway 163, he had never seen her again. He had patrolled the same roads, driven through the same desolate landscapes, but there had been nothing. He had almost convinced himself that it had been a trick of the light, a stress-induced hallucination. Almost. That changed on a warm night in August of 2021. The monsoon season had been late that year, and the air was thick with the smell of rain and wet earth. Begay was patrolling the remote area near Shiprock when he received a call from dispatch about a stranded motorist. The location was familiar, too familiar. Mile marker 23 on Highway 163, the same place where he had first seen the whispering woman 7 years earlier. As he approached the location, Begay's hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. He told himself it was just coincidence, that there was nothing supernatural about a broken-down vehicle on a deserted highway. But when his headlights cut through the darkness and caught the figure standing by the side of the road, he knew it was anything but. It was the same scene, replayed like a ghostly loop. It was a woman, wearing traditional Navajo clothing, her back to him. Begay slowed the cruiser, his heart a heavy drum in his chest. This time, however, he didn't stop. He didn't even reach for his spotlight. He kept driving, his foot pressing the accelerator, passing the figure without slowing, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He would not engage. He would not be a part of this story again. A mile down the road, he pulled over to the shoulder, the cruiser's engine idling. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He called dispatch. "Cancel that 1047 at mile marker 23. Vehicle appears to have left the area." "Copy that, 714, came the reply. "Anything else to report?" Begay hesitated, then decided against mentioning what he had seen. Who would believe him? And more importantly, what would it unleash? Negative. Returning to patrol. As he spoke, his radio went dead, replaced by a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A voice he had not heard in 7 years, but recognized instantly. "Michael Begay, you didn't stop tonight." Begay felt a cold dread wash over him, a dread so profound it felt like a physical blow. He put the cruiser in drive, intending to return to the station, to end his shift early, to go home. But when he tried to accelerate, the engine sputtered and died. The dashboard lights flickered and went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. The silence that rushed in was total, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The whisper continued, now seeming to come from right beside him, from the passenger seat. "You stopped 7 years ago. You were afraid then, but you stayed. You continued to patrol these roads. Why leave now?" Begay reached for his weapon, his hand trembling. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing I've always wanted. Justice, understanding, a chance to tell my story, a chance to go home." Begay felt the cruiser shift, as if someone had leaned against it, the springs groaning under a weight that was not there. He looked in the rearview mirror, and his heart stopped. She was sitting in the back seat, her face still obscured by long dark hair, but he could feel her eyes on him. "My name was Sarah Holliday," she said, her voice clearer now, tinged with an ancient sadness. "I disappeared 25 years ago while walking in the desert near my family's homestead. No one ever found me. No one ever looked for very long. They said I ran away, that I went to the city, but I didn't." Begay remembered the case, a young woman who had vanished without a trace. The search had lasted 3 days before being called off due to lack of leads. He remembered the footprints Benjamin Chi had described, the ones that had started and ended nowhere. But I didn't disappear, the whispering woman continued. I was taken by someone who knew these roads, who knew where to hide a body where it would never be found. Someone who wears the same uniform as you do. Begay felt a sudden, cold realization, a connection he hadn't made before. John Holliday, he said aloud, the sheepherder who reported the strange footprints. Your father. My father, the whispering woman replied. He knows what happened. He found my turquoise necklace near the canyon where I was killed. He didn't know where it came from, but he knew it was important. He gave it to his grandson, a good boy who wanted to be a police officer, a young man named Daniel Nez. Begay remembered Nez, the officer who had disappeared in 2018, his patrol car found at the bottom of a ravine. He remembered the dashcam footage, the way Nez had walked toward the figure. Nez figured it out too late, the whispering woman said. He realized the necklace he wore was mine, that it had been taken from my body. He came looking for answers, and he found them. He found me. And now he is with me, and he is at peace. Who killed you? Begay asked, his voice barely a whisper, a prayer to the darkness. The whispering woman leaned forward, her face still in shadow, but Begay could feel her presence, a cold spot in the air. Look at the evidence that has been collected and filed away. The reports that mention strange footprints, radio interference, figures that appear and disappear. The officers who have resigned, transferred, or disappeared. The pattern is there if you know where to look. It is a map of his patrols, his crimes. He thinks he is safe, that his secrets are buried in the desert. But the desert remembers, and I remember. The cruiser's engine suddenly roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Begay looked in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. The whispering woman was gone, but her words remained, echoing in the silence of his mind. He sat there for a long time, the engine running, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it real? Or had he imagined it, his mind playing tricks after years of hearing stories about the whispering woman? But he knew it was real. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. The next morning, Begay accessed the cold case files, starting with the disappearance of Sarah Holliday. As he read through the reports, he noticed something that others had missed: a series of similar incidents reported in the area where she had disappeared, all occurring on the same night each year. Incidents involving officers who had since resigned, transferred, or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The most recent report was dated just 6 months earlier, filed by an officer named Jake Wilson, who had requested a transfer after encountering strange phenomena at an abandoned trading post. Begay read Wilson's description of the items he had found: a child's shoe, a silver bracelet, a turquoise necklace, and a photograph of a young Navajo woman. Begay felt a cold realization settle over him. He cross-referenced the patrol logs from the night Sarah Holliday disappeared with the duty rosters from that year, and then he saw it. One name, one officer who had been on patrol in that exact area, who had filed a report about a suspicious person that night and then had his report quietly amended. An officer who was still on the force, a respected senior officer, a man who had trained Begay himself. Sergeant Yazzie. Begay felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew that no one would believe him. How could he accuse a respected sergeant of murder based on the testimony of a ghost? He printed out the files, the evidence, the connections. He wrote a long, detailed report explaining everything, and then he submitted his resignation, effective immediately. He didn't give a reason, just packed his personal belongings and left without saying goodbye to anyone. His former colleagues never saw him again, but some say that on certain nights, if you drive down Highway 163 past mile marker 23, you might see a cruiser parked on the shoulder, its headlights cutting through the darkness. And if you stop to investigate, you might hear a whisper on the wind, calling your name, warning you away, or perhaps inviting you to help solve a crime that the living cannot touch. No trace of Begay's report against Sergeant Yazzie was ever found in the official archives. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, but nowhere more so than within the borders of Navajo Nation. Here, the line between the natural and supernatural blurs, shaped by centuries of tradition, belief, and a deep, abiding respect for the forces that govern the land and the sky. The stories we've shared tonight are drawn from official reports, witness testimonies, and recorded incidents, each one verified, documented, and yet unexplained. They form a pattern, a dark tapestry woven from threads of fear, loss, and a strange, terrible knowledge. What connects these encounters is not just the figure known as the Whispering Woman, but the pattern of silence that follows. Officers who resign without explanation, evidence that vanishes overnight, reports filed but never investigated further. In a world where answers are expected, these cases offer only questions that echo across the desert landscape. The official documentation often uses sterile language: unidentified female, radio interference, officer resigned for personal reasons. But the stories shared between officers, in the quiet moments before a shift or late at night in the break room, tell a different tale. The Navajo people have long understood that there are forces beyond human comprehension, beings that exist in the space between what we see and what we know. The Whispering Woman appears to be one such entity, not necessarily malevolent, but certainly mysterious. She seeks something, though what exactly remains unclear. Justice, recognition, or simply to have her story told, to have her name remembered after her body was forgotten in the unforgiving desert. What we do know is this: since 2014, at least 9 Navajo Nation police officers have encountered the Whispering Woman. Of those, 3 have disappeared without a trace, 4 have transferred to other districts or resigned, and 2 continue to patrol, though never alone after dark. The pattern suggests something more than coincidence, though official investigations have reached no definitive conclusions. The case of Officer Daniel Nez remains open, listed as missing, presumed deceased. The personnel files of Janet Tso, Lucy Thompson, Maria Martinez, and Jake Wilson all contain the same quiet notation: transferred or resigned. The name of Michael Begay is simply gone from the roster, as if he never existed. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these encounters is the personal nature of them. The Whispering Woman knows the officers' names, their histories, their losses. She speaks to them in a dialect few understand, yet they comprehend her perfectly. She seems to draw them in, not with threats or violence, but with knowledge that no one should possess. She knows about the necklace, the bracelet, the child's shoe. She knows about the arguments with their families, the fears they hold for their children. She knows their guilt and their regrets. This intimacy is what makes her so terrifying. She is not just a ghost, she is a confidant, a witness to their innermost selves. In the end, what we are left with is silence, the silence of unanswered questions, of unresolved cases, of officers who can no longer speak of what they've seen. The desert night swallows these stories, leaving only whispers on the wind and footprints that lead nowhere. The final report, filed by an officer who has since vanished, accuses a respected sergeant of a decades-old murder, a crime witnessed only by a ghost. That report, like so much of the evidence in these cases, has disappeared. The official record is clean, sterile, and incomplete. The truth, it seems, is buried out there in the red dust and canyons, guarded by a woman who knows the names of those who failed to find her. The motifs that recur throughout these accounts, the dead radio, the impossible footprints, the knowing of a name, are not just spooky details. They are signposts, markers of a reality that exists just beyond our perception. They are a language of the unexplained, a forensic trail left by something that does not adhere to the laws of physics or time. The radio silence is not a malfunction. It is a conversation. The footprints are not a prank. They are a map. The whispered name is not a threat. It is an invitation to see what is really there, in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the headlights. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Our researchers review every submission, and those that can be verified may be featured in future episodes. The silence of the desert is vast, but it is not always empty. Sometimes it is filled with stories waiting to be told. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.